It has become known what Ukraine is actually using to drive Crimea out of Russian hands.
The only route for delivering Russian soldiers, ammunition, and fuel from temporarily occupied Crimea has been attacked.
The Ukrainian Armed Forces are wiping out important bridges in the south with an entirely new type of weapon. Huge FirePoint drones with a wingspan of 5 meters and a 100-kilogram explosive payload, as well as thermobaric Hippo drones, are right now cutting the last arteries of the occupiers in Chongar, Armyansk, and Armyansk.
These devices have become a new threat to the Kremlin's critical supply lines. They hit harder than regular quadcopters with grenades, but are significantly cheaper to produce compared to long-range drones.
And while enemy logistics are writhing in agony from the strikes of these cheap but incredibly powerful machines, a clear plan is emerging that these attacks are just the preparation. The operation for complete liberation has begun. Ukraine is bringing Crimea back home. This has happened for the first time since 2014. The peninsula is being brought back home. The Crimean trap for Putin is snapping shut. The plan for complete capture is already on the table. That very operation in the south has begun. Bridges have been cut, the arteries of fuel and logistics destroyed. What awaits the occupiers next? How does complete isolation turn the peninsula into a massive trap? And how will total panic force the occupiers to surrender? A detailed plan for liberation right now. Greetings, this is the channel Ukraine Today, Andrei Silakov, and the latest events. The systematic destruction of Russian logistics in the south is the foundation of a large-scale operation to return Crimea. For the first time since 2014, the deoccupation of the peninsula has moved from being just a loud slogan to the realm of military possibilities. So, it is quite realistic that the Ukrainian Armed Forces will move on Crimea. And right now, there are many options for how exactly this could happen. For example, some of these realistic scenarios were described quite accurately by the well-known analyst Michael Naki, whose assessments largely coincide with what we are directly observing on the battlefield.
This is literally just the beginning. It will only get worse from here. In fact, the strikes on the bridges, which have led to the near-total isolation of Crimea, have become a kind of cherry on top that Ukraine has been carefully preparing for years, specifically for this very moment. But this story is unlikely to end with the logistical isolation of the peninsula.
The main stage, which is unfolding before our eyes, is a total logistical lockdown. The Ukrainian army is already using heavy drones, such as the FirePoint FP2 and Hippo, to destroy the bridges on the isthmuses. The Novorossiya highway is under heavy fire control, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet has already cowardly fled to Novorossiysk. The Crimean bridge, which is already on its last legs, is awaiting a final suppression of air defenses and a missile strike at the right moment, after which any attempts to repair it will be harshly thwarted by drones.
The Ukrainian offensive in this area may be aided by the fact that, after the Russians repelled the attack in 2023, the defensive lines were neither completed nor upgraded. But why bother if Russia is always on the offensive? As a result, these positions are characterized by large concentrations of infantry, which are relatively vulnerable to drone strikes, such as those from Ukrainian vampires. These are also known as Baba Yaga, which drop munitions of calibers unheard of in 2023, like mortar shells or TM-62 anti-tank mines.
When the logistical noose finally tightens, the Russian grouping in the south will face a critical fuel shortage. The point is that without a stable supply of fuel, generators powering electronic warfare systems will immediately shut down, and Russian drone operators will simply be left blind. It is precisely this paralysis of the enemy that will become the perfect window of opportunity to launch the second phase, a large-scale ground offensive by the Ukrainian Armed Forces in the Zaporizhzhia direction, targeting Tokmak and Melitopol.
Now, with the real prospect of these routes being cut off looming large, the ZAI forces have started seriously talking about a new Ukrainian offensive operation in the same area. Moreover, such discussions were taking place even before the start of Operation Logistics Lockdown, when Z authors seriously assumed that Ukrainian forces would not stop after driving the Russians out of Stepnohirsk and reaching Kamyansk, but would continue on to Vasilivka and Tokmak, from where it is already quite close to Melitopol, through which the notorious R280 highway passes.
This offensive will be fundamentally different from the grueling campaign of 2023, as Ukraine has for the first time accumulated technological advantages. Impassable minefields will now be overcome with the help of modern above-ground sapper drones. In addition, the new Ukrainian Army Corps have become completely autonomous. They have received their own drone regiments and HIMARS systems under direct tactical command. This will allow Corps commanders to instantly wipe out enemy reserves without lengthy coordination with higher command.
For years, Crimea has been at the center of Ukrainian planning for ground operations. This is not surprising because in the event of hypothetical attacks toward Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russians would be able to repel them using numerous logistical routes that lead directly from Russia. But Crimea is far enough from Russian territory that it could be isolated as a result of a ground operation.
Moreover, once Ukrainian forces break through and reach open ground beyond the Surovikin Line, they will no longer encounter any major new fortifications, since the occupiers simply did not build them, relying on a perpetual war of positions. While all the attention and the meager logistical resources of the Russian command are focused on patching up holes in Zaporizhzhia, their defensive positions along the Dnipro and deep in the rear will inevitably be weakened to a critical point.
However, the situation has now changed. Firstly, as some Z-bloggers complain, the positions of the Russian armed forces on the Dnipro have been weakened to the limit because everything is being sent to the Zaporizhzhia direction to repel Ukrainian counterattacks and simultaneously advance on Mala-Tokmachka. Secondly, at least the small bridgeheads can now be supplied by drones, as is currently happening, for example, at the positions of Ukrainian forces near Kupiansk on the eastern bank of the Oskil. Thirdly, in fact, a logistical lockdown will prevent the Russian armed forces from endlessly transferring reinforcements, and without this, it will be impossible to eliminate the Ukrainian bridgeheads. Just recall the enormous losses suffered by Russian forces in the battles for those same Krinky.
The defense forces will take advantage of this sudden weakening of the front to carry out the third phase. Daring lightning operations on the left bank of Kherson region and the Kinburn Spit. According to the expert, the logistics of the Spit are extremely vulnerable. A successful raid there will permanently cut off Russian control over the waters of the Dnipro estuary, and the uninterrupted supply of Ukrainian bridgeheads on the other bank will be ensured by a fleet of heavy cargo drones, minimizing risks for the boats.
One of the operations that will definitely be carried out, and I am absolutely certain of this, is a raid on the Kinburn Spit, on the southern shore of the Dnipro estuary, control over which allows the Russians to threaten navigation between the Black Sea and the Dnipro. Now, this very spit is highly vulnerable. The logistical routes pass just a few kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled positions on the opposite bank of the estuary. Moreover, there have already been multiple raids on this spit, but so far Russian forces have managed to repel them. The question is, will they be able to do so in the future when logistics on the spit reach a critical state? This is despite the fact that rumors are already spreading about the Russians evacuating from there. There is no confirmation yet. Maybe these are just rumors, but the regular targeting of positions on the spit by drones, including those launched from unmanned boats, could very well turn these rumors into reality.
The fourth stage will be the transfer of hostilities directly to the coast of Crimea itself. Due to the systematic destruction of fuel and lubricant depots at airfields, Russian aviation will completely lose the ability to patrol the coastal zone.
As for Crimea itself, amphibious operations there could very well be at least in the planning stages as well. As the supply of fuel to the peninsula deteriorates, Russian control over the waters around Crimea will also degrade, since it is maintained by helicopters, airplanes, including exotic amphibious aircraft like the B-12, Orion drones, which are Russia's answer to the Bayraktar, and other forces and assets, all of which have one thing in common: their flights require fuel.
And the neutralization of all these capabilities will open the sea gates for Ukrainian special operations groups to land using high-speed motorboats along the entire perimeter. Their support, as well as the delivery of ammunition, will be handled by ultra-heavy cargo FPV drones with a payload capacity of up to 200 kilograms.
It should not be forgotten that all these operations will take place amid total panic, primarily among Russians who have come to Crimea during the years of occupation to work, for example, in the occupation administrative and security agencies, and who have good reason to fear, at the very least, prosecution by Ukraine. The same applies to collaborators and propagandists of all kinds who will try by any means, fair or foul, to get off the peninsula.
And finally, the final nail in the coffin of the occupation will be driven by enormous informational and psychological pressure.
And Ukrainians can further fan the flames with the help of information and psychological operations. For example, they could hack some Crimean radio station or TV channel and announce a mass evacuation from the peninsula so that local residents would flood the remaining logistical routes available to the Russian armed forces, hindering their ability to respond quickly to the actions of Ukrainian troops in Crimea.
In addition, massive strikes on the power grid will plunge the blockaded peninsula into a blackout, and hijacking TV and radio broadcasts to announce an emergency evacuation will cause sheer panic. Cut off, deprived of electricity, communications, and ammunition, the Russian garrison will face a very simple choice: total self-destruction or surrender, since there will be nowhere to retreat. And while the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing Crimea for historic deoccupation, the entire southern front has already turned into a zone of total terror for the occupiers. Land routes have been cut off, the Sea of Azov has become a deadly trap, and any attempts by Russian generals to save the supply lines only accelerate the collapse of the entire system. How will Putin's logistics start to fall apart along the entire length? Watch our report to find out.
Primorsk is burning, guys. They're shelling in Primorsk. The Ukrainian Armed Forces are breaking through to the Sea of Azov. The enemy's logistics in the Azov region are already crying out for help. However, the power of unmanned systems offers the occupiers nothing but fiery destruction. In the south, the air already smells of a new large-scale operation.
The geography of the strikes has covered about 20 regions of Russia, as well as the waters of the Black and Azov Seas. Bridges, air defense systems, oil depots, substations, factories, UAV warehouses, and concentrations of occupying troops are being systematically destroyed. So what's going on there? The special military operation is still going according to plan.
And that's not all. Ukrainian drones carried out a real inspection of the occupiers' shipping and simultaneously visited 5 cargo vessels at once, all of which were serving the needs of the Russian army. The strikes hit targets near Berdyansk, Mariupol, and even in the area of Yalta in the Donetsk region. For the Kremlin, this is much more painful than it might seem at first glance. It is through the Azov ports that the occupiers have been transporting ammunition, fuel, equipment, and other cargo for years, without which the war quickly starts to stall. Now, however, every voyage increasingly resembles a maritime lottery, where instead of arriving at port, you might encounter a Ukrainian drone. The situation is especially symbolic because these very ports were used not only for military logistics, but also for exporting looted Ukrainian resources, particularly grain. It seems that for part of the Russian fleet, the export season is gradually turning into a season of major problems, and the Sea of Azov is looking less and less like a safe rear area and more like a high-risk zone. Meanwhile, the transport blockade of Crimea is gaining momentum. The occupiers had to close off another important crossing on the peninsula, the bridge from Henishevsk to the Arabat Spit. And this is already the second key artery to be taken out of commission in recent days. For Russian logistics, the situation is increasingly resembling a bad dream, where there are fewer roads and more problems. The head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, Petro Andriushchenko, reports that the strike likely hit one of the bridges in the Henishevsk-Arabat Spit area. Combined with the problems in the Chongar direction, this creates an extremely unpleasant situation for the Russian forces. What was recently considered a reliable rear is gradually turning into a bottleneck, through which it is becoming increasingly difficult to push troops, equipment, and ammunition. This is especially painful against the backdrop of the fuel crisis. After a series of Ukrainian strikes on oil depots and logistical facilities, the occupiers have already faced disruptions in fuel supplies. Now, every newly blocked route only amplifies the effect. It gives the impression that Russian logistics are starting to operate on the principle: the longer the road to Crimea, the shorter the reserves in the tanks. And the most unpleasant thing for the Kremlin is that problems are piling up simultaneously from different directions. Ukrainian drones are increasingly confidently hunting fuel tankers and trucks deep in the rear, while the land routes to the peninsula are coming under constant control. If Crimea used to be called Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier, now it increasingly resembles an island that is slowly but surely being cut off from supplies. Things are also unsettled in the Donetsk region. The Russians are recording recommendations for traveling the Mariupol-Donetsk highway. They say, keep your speed at no less than 160 kilometers per hour and keep a close eye on the sky, just in case some surprise comes flying in.
Maximum vigilance. Keep your eyes on the sky. Don't turn on music, smoke cigarettes, or drink coffee. Your task is to watch the sky so you can be absolutely sure there's nothing hanging over your head.
There is no peace for the enemy, even where they counted on a calm rear. It seems the occupiers in Mariupol and the Azov region have found themselves in an endless series called Arrival Flash Blackout. What was supposed to become a showcase of recovery for Russian propaganda is increasingly starting to look like a place where the lights go out more often than good news appears for the occupation administration. The most interesting thing is that a strike on a substation isn't just about light bulbs in apartments. For the Russian army, it's a blow to the very heart of their logistics. Key supply routes for the southern front pass through Mariupol. The railway, which the occupiers have heavily relied on after problems with the Crimean bridge, quickly turns into expensive scrap metal without electricity. No electricity means no normal train movement, which leads to problems with delivering fuel, equipment, and ammunition. As a result, the Russians have to transport cargo using truck convoys. And this is where things get really unpleasant. The roads become clogged with trucks and fuel tankers, which make excellent targets for Ukrainian drones. It creates a rather ironic picture. In trying to save their logistics, the occupiers themselves turn it into a long line of potential targets. And along with the electricity, the Kremlin's main myth of a safe rear disappears as well. Mariupol, which Russian propaganda for years tried to portray as a symbol of stability under occupation, increasingly resembles a city under constant fire control. And the more often substations go dark there, the harder it is to explain to local residents why this supposedly calm rear lives by the laws of a frontline zone. The situation is looking less and less controllable for the Kremlin. The Azov coast, land routes to Crimea, fuel logistics and rear hubs, all of this is gradually turning into a system where each new supply artery lasts only until the first disruption. Russian propaganda is still trying to sell the idea of stability, but reality keeps making its own adjustments every time. Cargo is moving more slowly, routes are getting longer, and the risks are getting closer. And in this new geography of war, the main question is no longer where the next strike will be, but how many more routes this logistical structure can withstand before it starts to fall apart along its entire length.
And this logistical chaos is already spreading far beyond the front, grounding Russian aviation completely. Due to a total fuel shortage, airports across the country, from Makhachkala to Nizhny Novgorod, are imposing widespread restrictions on aircraft refueling. See next how our long-range sanctions are paralyzing the aggressor's skies and forcing the Kremlin to shamefully cancel its main propaganda shows.
Territorial concessions by Ukraine will not ensure lasting peace. They will only give the Kremlin an opportunity to regain strength and continue its aggression, said former commander of the Canadian Joint Operations Command Christopher Coates in an interview with Ukrinform. In his opinion, the only fundamental basis for a lasting peace can be a military victory for Ukraine. That is why the strikes by Ukraine's defense forces on the main source of income for the aggressor country, the Russian oil industry, are of strategic importance.
They force Russia to spread its resources thin, reduce its revenues, and remind Russians that war comes at a cost. These strikes alone will not determine the outcome of the war, but they are an important part of a broader strategy. Christopher Coates, commander of the Canadian Joint Operations Command in 2020 to 2021, in an interview with Ukrinform agency.
The aggressor country is now more vulnerable than ever before, the analyst is convinced. So far, the Kremlin has managed to keep the situation in the country under control, but losses, both human and economic, are accumulating. Russia's foreign trade turnover has dropped to its lowest level in the past 15 years, according to researchers from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the reserves of the National Wealth Fund were equivalent to 6.5% of GDP. By April 2026, the volume of liquid assets had decreased to just 1.8%.
Now, even among the Russian population, people are starting to take off their rose-colored glasses a bit, and there's a certain unrest, dissatisfaction, and even questions directed at Putin about what exactly is going on. And it's no coincidence that even journalists have started asking him uncomfortable questions. He was even asked about his declining approval ratings, how he feels about it, and about the difficult economic situation in Russia. By the way, he didn't say anything about that. He completely avoided answering that question.
Due to fears of an attack by Ukrainian drones, for the first time in 23 years, the Russia Day concert was moved from Red Square to a cultural center on Preobrazhenskaya Square in the eastern district of the capital. And the event program was significantly shortened. The Russia Day concert was one of the key propaganda shows. Apparently, the regime was afraid of a repeat of what happened with the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Despite extraordinary security measures, just a few hours before its opening, Ukrainian drones visited St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region. They attacked energy facilities and a Russian naval base in Kronstadt. Drones also arrived on the day the SPIF closed. The targets were the Russian Navy's arsenal and the naval base in Kronstadt.
After a successful attack on the warehouses of the 15th Arsenal of the Russian Navy, a fire and secondary detonation have been observed there. Missiles and ammunition are stored at the facility. Fires have also been recorded in the area of the Kronstadt Naval Base and the Kronstadt Marine Plant. From a statement by the Security Service of Ukraine on Telegram.
Ukraine will cut off occupied Crimea from Russia, promised Robert Brovdy, commander of the UAV forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are systematically implementing the so-called logistical lockdown of the peninsula, severing military transport and energy routes.
Look at the daily strikes that are completely destroying the logistics that have been built up, well, for decades, starting from the moment Crimea was occupied. Now our armed forces are actively destroying this entire process. Naturally, this affects how Putin himself is perceived within his own country.
Over the course of a year, from June 2025 to June 2026, the UAV forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces struck more than 356,000 Russian targets, according to the president of Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky assured that there will be many more long-range attacks on military and strategic targets in the Russian rear. Karina Loloyan for Freedom TV channel.
And what do you think about these events? Write your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.